The Odyssey, the truth hidden for 2,700 years, the way back home. Do you think the Odyssey is about adventure, about monsters, wondrous goddesses, gods, and epic battles? Wrong. It's about what happens to a soul when it spends 20 years on the brink of survival and then has to pretend it's okay back home. And I'll prove it to you with a single scene that most people have been misreading for 2,700 years. You know, the story of a man who fought for 10 years, survived monsters, gods, and storms, and who, when he finally arrived home, couldn't recognize his own home. It's not science fiction. It's Homer. It's the Odyssey. And today I'm going to show you something that common sense never taught you. Odysseus does not return as a hero. He returns as a broken, destroyed man, wearing a mask to avoid falling apart. Stay until the end of the video, because the third act of this story will show you what happens when trauma enters the house before the owner does. In the meantime, leave a like and subscribe. 20 years have passed. Wow, it doesn't seem like it at all. 10 of those years were spent at war, and another 10 were a Herculean attempt to return home to the bosom of his beloved. During this time, the son grew up without a father. The wife grew old struggling alone, and 108 men invaded their home and began devouring everything Odysseus had built. Most fairy tale narratives portray the return as a celebration. Homer, no. He turns the return into a psychological experiment, because when Odysseus arrives at the shore of Ithaca, Homer says something disturbing. He didn't recognize his own home, and it was Athena who had to tell him what place this was and where he was. Notice something. He wasn't tired or fatigued. No, he simply couldn't connect who he was with his past. It was a dissociation. And this was the price of surviving what he survived. Odysseus's trauma, what 20 years do to a soul. Psychiatrist Jonathan Shea spent decades treating Vietnam veterans with severe PTSD. But one day, something he had read sparked an insight. He realized that the most complex cases had already been written about 2,700 years earlier by Homer. In his book Odysseus in America, Shea identifies modern clinical patterns in the Odyssey: chronic distrust, a compulsive need to lie and hide, violent outbursts, a feeling of being constantly visited by the dead, and a profound inability to reconnect. Odysseus lost all of his traveling companions. He saw men die in various ways. Things that no normal human being should ever have to witness. Furthermore, he made decisions that cost many lives, and I don't know if for good or for bad, but he survived to find out. The survivor's guilt doesn't appear anywhere as a monologue, but it shows in her behavior. And Odysseus's behavior on the return journey is that of someone who doesn't feel entitled to simply go back home. He wanted to, but he didn't want to. He didn't think it was fair. Jung and the persona, the beggar as a mask for survival. When Odysseus arrives in Ithaca, he does not appear as king. He appears disguised as a beggar, and it wasn't by chance. Many people interpret this as a smart strategy, but not Jung. Jung would read it as a collapse of the persona. For Jung, the persona is the social mask. The role you present to the world in order to, in a sense, be accepted, recognized, legitimized, recommended, admired, or stigmatized. And what happens to the persona when you're gone for 20 years? She becomes detached from her true identity. Odysseus no longer knew who he was without the war, without the battles, without the cunning, without his companions, without his role as king. So he goes to his own home as nobody. Yes, Odysseus returned not as a victorious, pompous hero. He didn't return as nobody. Exactly the same name he used to deceive the Cyclops. No one hurt me. And here is the cruel mirror that the unconscious absorbed. He continued to be nobody even after arriving home. If you're enjoying this, please subscribe, like, and share, and leave a comment. It would be great to hear your perspective, which may be different, but let's get back to it. And now it's the shadow's turn. The shadow at the banquet, he observes before acting. Before revealing his identity, Odysseus spends days inside his own house disguised as a beggar, observing, being insulted, being humiliated by his wife's suitors, and he can handle it, not out of cowardice, but because the violence he carried within him, stemming from the injustice of having spent 20 years away from the comfort of his family, was too great to be released unchecked. This is the most sophisticated Jungian perspective on this narrative. The shadow. Everything that Odysseus saw, did, and lost in those 20 years was absorbed by his unconscious, pushed below the surface of his rational, functional consciousness. Anger, blame, cooked, brutal violence. And when that content finally comes out, in the arc scene, in the battle with the suitors, it's not just a victory, it's like an eruption, a catharsis of accumulated shadow. In the arch scene, the self-revealed, faced with so much pressure from her suitors, Penelope announces a contest. Whoever manages to bend Odysseus's bow and shoot it down the row of 12 axes, lined up, will marry her and become king. All suitors try, everyone fails. And then the beggar, dirty, ragged, nameless, asks for his turn. I'm sorry. The son tries to defend him, and he simply picks up the bow, examines each curve with the care of someone who knows that object like the back of his hand, and shoots with the certainty, precision, and strength of someone who has accumulated 20 years of struggles and grief at the moment when everything comes to the surface. At that moment, Jung would say, the self has emerged. The self, the Jungian archetype of wholeness, only manifests when the false persona is abandoned and the shadow is integrated. But Odysseus doesn't become a hero in this scene. He becomes whole, integrated, he becomes one. But their unification does not last, because the most difficult reunion is yet to come. And Penelope, the most honest reunion in literature. Here's what movies don't usually show you. When Odysseus defeats the suitors and Euryclea runs to wake Penelope with the news, he's back, the suitors are dead. Penelope's response is not tears of joy, it's uncertain. She goes down to the living room and stares at him in silence. And modern commentators call this a cold reading, but it's not that. It's the opposite. On this point, Penelope is the most honest woman in the Odyssey, because she spent 20 years being deceived, pressured, surrounded, harassed, in the midst of grief. She learned that anything can be a trap. Then she tests him. She pretends that the marital bed can be moved, knowing that it's impossible because Odysseus built it around a living olive tree. And when he reacts angrily and explains why it's impossible to move that bed, she knows, not by the bow, not because of the scar, but because of an intimate detail that only the two of them know. Reconnection doesn't happen in battle. It happens within a shared secret about something intimate, sensitive, or marital. But before the reunion with Penelope, there's a scene that few people talk about. Odysseus arrives in Ithaca and does not recognize it. Then he finds his old dog, Argos, the only being who recognizes him immediately, and dies soon after seeing his owner. Modern research on trauma shows something similar. When a human being lives in survival mode for too long, the familiar begins to be processed as a threat, not as home. The house, your home, is no longer just a place. It's an abstract idea that he was pursuing across the Mediterranean Sea without knowing if it still existed. And when it finally exists, it's different from everything he had stored in his memory. Everything has changed. The house grew in directions he couldn't control. The son became a different man. The woman became a different woman. Stronger, more tired, more distrustful. Odysseus's return proves that you can't freeze one life while moving on to another. There are no separate areas. Family life, work life, social life, spiritual life. We are all one single being. Jung and the Individuation process, the Odyssey as an inner map. Research suggests that the entire Odyssey can be read as a metaphor for the Jungian individuation process, the separation of the Achaean heroes, beginning of the ego's solitary journey. The female monsters and deities, Circe, Calypso, sirens, encounter and discrimination of the aspects of the anima, the descent into Hades, confrontation with the deepest self, comrades who die, integration of the shadow, arriving in Phaeacia, naked, alone without belongings, radical disidentification with the persona. In other words, Odysseus is not traveling through the Mediterranean. He is traveling within himself, and one only arrives home when there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to discover. No more masks, no more titles, no more armor, only marital secrets. The only thing nobody else knew, the truth that Homer knew. Jonathan Shea wrote that the Odyssey offers explicit portrayals of behaviors common among returning soldiers, a search for danger, outbursts of violence, an obsessive need for control, loafing, and an inability to trust. But Homer goes beyond diagnosis. He proposes a cure, and healing is not a battle. This is where a conversation will take place. It's the bed scene. Because what breaks Odysseus's trauma isn't proving strength. He already had that. Nor is it a heroic resume. He knew that. But rather being recognized by someone who truly knew him. Not a version of himself, but his real self. Not the hero of the war. Not the king of Ithaca, but rather the man who built that bed with his own hands. This is what Shea calls healing through testimony, to be seen and recognized by someone who understands what you carry. So here's what the Odyssey really is. It's not the story of a hero returning triumphant. It's the story of a fragmented soul trying to reunite with its own past. Odysseus arrives home with more internal scars, pain, and grief than his outward appearance might suggest, and he can only cross the final threshold, the real reunion, when he accepts being seen without a mask, without the persona of the king, without the warrior's shadow, but with the secret of the bed. And here is the question Homer leaves you with. When you finally get home, whatever home means to you, how will you arrive? Will you have the courage to show up as yourself? Because the oldest truth in literature says that home is not just any physical place, but home is the moment when someone truly sees you and accepts you completely as you are. That's when you don't run away. This is the realm of the depths. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments if you want part 2, Penelope's perspective. Kisses and bye-bye.